welcome to today's interview. I am Dr. Hanna Lucas, and I'm really pleased to have a very good and longtime friend and mentor, Professor Ron Dart, with me today.
Oh, wonderful to be with you, Hanna.
Yeah. So, would you like to just introduce yourself and give a little kind of story of your background in academia and also in the church?
Sure. 1980s, I worked with Amnesty International, and Amnesty International was at the time known as probably the finest human rights organization in the world at national and international levels. I then went on to teach retired just this past year after almost 35 years of teaching in the area of political science or political philosophy, and religious studies at University of the Fraser Valley in British Columbia, just outside of Vancouver. Much of my teaching career has focused on the classical tradition of Western thought, civilization, and then how it has unfolded into the Christian tradition of the patristics East and West, and then as that unfolding has taken place into the Middle Ages, and then the rupture that took place in the 16th century with the coming to be of the Protestant Reformation, whether the Lutheran variety, the Calvinists, the Anabaptists, the Baptists, the Quakers that emerged at this period of time, and then the reactionary element of the Roman Catholic Church with the Trent, and then how the Anglican heritage, which I come out of, my genetic code is much more the rich 2,000-year-old Anglican tradition, and how it found a middle way between what was happening on the continent, and yet even the tensions within the Anglican tradition itself.
Thanks, Ron. So today we're hanging out in your home, on your sofa, and I'm interested to kind of go on a spiritual and intellectual journey with you through some questions. So I thought today that we would begin to think about truth. So nothing big, just the question of truth. So it's been said that in the West, especially, we're in a post-truth context, and in debates within wider society, debates within the church, the question of truth kind of emerges explicitly and also kind of bubbles under the surface implicitly in different kind of conflicts that are happening there. So I wonder if we could just begin to kind of ponder that kind of perennial question that Pilate asks, quid est veritas? Like, what is truth?
Very important question, Hanna, and fascinatingly enough, it's been understood and the approach to it is varied, but the Greek word for truth, aletheia, when we get an alpha in Greek, like atheism, not theist, or agnostic, not about knowledge, aletheia has that alpha at the beginning, and the word that follows is letha, which in Greek mythology is the river of forgetfulness. And so the classical Greek understanding of truth is we must overcome the problem of forgetfulness, and that can be forgetfulness of the self. It can be forgetfulness of a civilization, which we have inherited or forgotten. The language of memoricide is very dominant these days, or amnesia. There's different words. And so in an attempt to recover truth, it's an attempt to overcome what we have forgotten, civilizationally, culturally. And there is an assault on Western civilization these days by a certain form of post-structuralism, anti-colonialism, that only takes the negative elements of the West and it ignores the rich heritage, the mother lode in which wisdom has been passed on. Historically, even our language of philosophy is philia, friends in search of Sophia, wisdom, Lady Wisdom, who draws, who woos, who welcomes people into the deeper meaning of life itself. So there's this real close connection between remembering, but what to remember? We remember when it means to be wise, but then how do we grow in wisdom? And this is why the best form of education, which comes from a Latin educare, is drawing out who we're meant to be. And how do we know what we're meant to be? Well, this is where good teachers, good spiritual mothers and fathers, Abba's good education in which we are exposed to the very, what Matthew Arnold would call the best that has been thought and said and done. And so the finest forms of education is a drawing forth culturally, civilizationally, philosophically, culturally, theologically, all of these wonderful flakes of gold that are a part of the shaft of the mother lode of Christianity, of Western civilization, and what it means for the formation of people on their all too human faith journey.
Mm-hmm. And so remembering truth, like learning or philosophia, this kind of pursuit of lady wisdom, or the pursuit of truth, being understood as unforgetting, that's really different from maybe a more modern vision where there is no intimation within to begin with, and it's sort of attacked or kind of uncovered and discovered as something entirely new. So it's almost like that there is this sort of this echo within us of the truth, or at least some kind of an intimation in that regard, that it's not something entirely foreign.
No, and within not only the Western tradition but Eastern also, there is the human longing for meaning, for purpose, for who am I, how am I to live my life, and so that longing, which is so much at the core of what it means to be human, often gets misdirected in a post-structuralist tradition in which we make up reality. There's a whole history, certainly in the West, of human identity and human nature, that we're an open-ended project. We get this in Locke, and Hobbes, and many others. And so we are shaped and made, socialized, conditioned by our time. The deeper anthropology or philosophical notion is that there is in seed form human longing for the ultimate. It's Augustine's famous saying in the Confessions, where he says, "Our heart is restless, O God, until they rest in you." And when hearts turn to finite things for fulfillment, inevitably they're unfulfilled, and people can turn from one finite thing to another to slake their thirst for meaning, but then they just become restless for more amusements, diversions, what T.S. Eliot talks about in Four Quartets, being diverted through diversion. So it's one diversion after another, which blinds us to the fact that no finite thing can fulfill the human hunger for meaning. And so there is this longing, which means it's part of bearing the image and likeness of God, for something ultimate. And we get starved if we feed off the penultimate for meaning, or anti-penultimate. And so part of truth in that sense is an attempt to forget the wrong places we go to for meaning, and to remember. This is why Plato in his works also, memory and remembering is very, very important, not just in terms of facts and information, but remembering who we are. This is why in philosophy the role of the teacher is to be a midwife to birth who a person is potentially, and then there's this transition from potential to actualization. In the language Greek, and kinesis is the motion from that. So Aristotle uses the image of the acorn that becomes the oak. And so truth in that much deeper sense is very connected to wisdom, connected to longing, to thirst, and knowing how that longing and thirst is properly oriented, what is called the ordo amoros, the ordering of our desires. Plato uses the image of a couple images he will use, but one is the ship of the self, or the ship of the church, or the ship of the state, in which we have many sailors like many desires. And if there's not a good captain on the ship of the self, or the ship of community, or the ship of the church, or the ship of state, there's mutiny on the Bounty, so people can be tossed to and fro through colliding, conflicting desires. And then the ship of the self or community goes all over the place. But where there is an ordering of desires, the ship of the self sails well across the difficult waters of time and the unpredictable weather of time. And so this classical tradition, which the Christian heritage inherited, largely through its Jewish heritage, but also through its Greco-Roman, and it's synthesized in the fullness of patristic heritage, was very much interested in terms of format. This is why the spiritual mothers and fathers were not just interested in getting the creeds right, and they were interested in that. They were necessary, but they weren't sufficient for a full understanding of what does all this thinking means in terms of self-understanding and formation and truly becoming who we're meant to be, deified in that classical sense, as we are participate in the very nature of God via Christ.
Mm. Yeah, and it's quite interesting. There's two senses of forgetting that we're talking about here. So the kind of amnesia is, the pursuit of truth, the aletheia, the unforgetting, and coming to truth is the kind of the lifting of the veil of a forgetfulness towards truth. But you almost used forgetting in a sense of like ascesis, or letting go of the idols and those kind of buzzy, busy kind of ball of desire, reaching out for various things that in the training of the soul and in the training of those desires and giving them banks, that's a forgetting, as in a letting go of those kind of idolatrous loves or misplaced loves, and the guiding of that desire.
Yeah, very important. And part of the classical Christian understanding of formation is the notion that one of us has to die. So what St. Paul would call the old Adam or the old Eve. And we hear a lot these days about addictions or attachments. And often that's focused on the self being attached to some external thing for meaning or fulfillment. But the deeper attachment is being attached to a false notion of the self. And when we're called to come and die, we're called to come and disengage ourselves by something deeper within us from that false self, which then gets attached to external things. So the deeper addiction is really to a false notion of identity that has to die. And we think of God as love, or God comes to burn or to kill. What is being killed is the false self, so the true self. And so it's like fire burning dross off gold so the gold can be revealed. But if our identity is connected to dross or to chaff, we very much complain about the fire or the sifting. But if we're willing to let go of the dross that we identify with our true self, we realize the gold is going to appear. Or the sifting that takes place if we identify with the chaff, then we fight back obstinately, vigorously, in a very animated way, because our self is identified with who we actually are not, but a socially conditioned construct. And of course, there's so many cultural signals that come our way of you dress like this, or look like this, or go on these trips, or have these possessions, or have this information or knowledge, or that's successful. And so then people turn their desires to things that will betray them. It's like the Francis Thompson found the hound of heaven, I'll betrayest thee that betrayest me. And so this deeper question, so we're actually called to forget who we think we are so we can remember who we really are. And this is at the heart of formation in the classical tradition of ascesis. Ascesis, in that sense, it's an Olympic term that was used for athletes training. And they had to let go of a lot of things. They had to focus in terms of what the goal was, the competition, the race of life. And so the actual discipline in Christianity is disciplining ourselves not to be attached to the false self. That's the deeper disengagement. And often most people identify themselves, in fact, with what they're not, and then they strongly resist letting go of that. But all it is dross and chaff that has to be let go of. So actually our true being. Evelyn Underhill has a lovely little quote in her book. There were a series of lectures in which she summed up much of her life's work in the spiritual life. She says, we spend too much time conjugating three verbs: to want, to have, and to do. And we've forgotten what it means to be. That's our cuckoo clock, which comes out regularly every half hour and on the hour, depending on the hour we're here. So that deeper transformation, because we live in a period of time in which the vita activa, the busy, the frantic, the driven life, is in one sense, it's banished, it's subordinated the vita contemplativa. And in the classical tradition, that's our other cuckoo clock. This one's it's the rooster that comes out to join us. It's not roosters in our backyard, of which we have many animals coming through, including bears and deer and much else. But it's like a zoo out at times out there with the animals coming through. But yeah, so what's very much happened in the West since an accelerated way since the Reformation has been this dominance and prioritizing of the vita activa as a way of knowing the self, of defining the self, and the vita contemplativa has been marginalized. It goes back to the Cain-Abel myth, in which Cain was the doer, the accomplishment, the performer, and Abel was the shepherd of being, to use Heidegger's sense in that sense. And so the Cains in our time as then tend to kill. They tend to subordinate, they tend to marginalize the Abels, and the type of Cain and Abel, fast forward, it's just Mary Martha in that sense. And so this is the dilemma of the post-Reformation era, in which the vita activa, which was once a much more religious element, becomes secularized, and all we have is the corporate culture, the busy culture, the driven culture, the indulgent culture, the culture of bloated appetites, always empty but always longing to fulfill. It's like Scylla Charybdis in Homer, in which Scylla was perpetually empty and devoured, and as soon as Scylla devoured, hungry again, because there was no center. It was a great emptiness, and the emptiness could only be fulfilled through devouring. In this case, sailors on the ship of Odysseus. And so these great myths of Homer, Odyssey, can speak very much to us today if we have ears to hear.
Yeah. And you said identity a number of times. So, many people moving about in their life, and not kind of pausing to contemplate their kind of North Star and their kind of orienting forces in their life. So identity, in a sort of shallow sense, becomes this marker that if I can discover and cling tightly to an identity, then I will navigate my life, and I will come to some kind of consummation and fulfillment. I will be kind of pursuing a self-actualization. And in what you just said, you kind of, again, we came back to these swirling desires and identity being kind of tied very closely to those desires. So I am my desire for this thing or that thing, or I am my activity, I am my job, or I am my kind of, my sexual orientation is my deepest identity. And how can that map onto this this kind of balance or wisdom between the Cain and the Abel, and so that there is sort of a deeper place to locate identity that's orienting us to kind of a higher end.
Absolutely. I mean, in the midst of our culture wars that we live with today, issues such as gender, identity, ethnicity, these have come to define what people cling to. There are also more trivial things, but often these are what cause some of the antagonisms, the polarization in the culture wars, and identity politics is one of those. And at a certain point, you want to say, is there more to discuss? Is there more to think through? Is this just a mirage to some degree that people think is real until they get there, and then it dissipates and disappears? Because at the deeper level in classical thought, they realize that the issues of gender, ethnicity, certain naive notions of identity lack the depth in probing the complex nature of desire and longing and thirst. And that's not a gender question. That's not an ethnicity question. That is something all humans share as a part of their human nature. How do we orient desires? How do we orient longings? And if people don't stop and begin to think about that, they then become victims of their own drivenness. So in the West, we use the language of liberty and freedom a lot. A lot of people think they're free when they're just victims of their own drivenness. They don't know how to stop. They don't know how to slow down. They don't know how to be still. And this is why I think the contemplative movement today, for some, they're realizing that, in fact, the vita activa is a dead end if there's no depth to it. And the contemplative way is an attempt to go deeper into the very questions of who am I? And what am I identifying with and being attached to that I have to let go of? Because it is an addiction, not only an external addiction, but the very self I identify or equate with the I is not even the real I. There is more depth. And the contemplative, this is why stillness, solitude, quietness, slowing down is very hard for people because they're so addicted to doing, to performing, to action. And so they think there's nothing there. And to sit still, to be silent, is to go to those places deeper, much deeper than the actor on the stage. It's to get off the stage and ask, now, who am I when I'm not performing? And who is that identify with the I and that actor, that performer? Is there more to it than the script we're reading, we're acting? And that's the mystery of the contemplative way, in which it's part of what Chaucer was called the pilgrimage of life in the Canterbury Tales, as we travel with others on the path of the faith life, the path of journeying into meaning, to purpose, to true freedom, not the silly freedom that is constantly bartered, trucked, and trade in our culture wars.
And I was just thinking, as you were speaking, that it would be a misunderstanding or naive to think that the kind of the Cain and the Abel and the Mary and the Martha and the active life and the contemplative life are kind of a dichotomy, or that one has to choose between them. But it sounds like that there is sort of a healthy hierarchy there, that there is a priority to the one, or to the contemplative, perhaps over the active, or maybe you can sort of describe that they would exist in a certain kind of blessed harmony, not one sort of conquering over the other, or victorious over the other, but they would exist in a certain harmony in the way that God has designed the human person, and that coming to that harmony and that hierarchy but would be kind of the path of peace, and would also be the path of wisdom.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lovely quote by Bunyan. It says, "He footed it well, and she answered him handsomely." And I think it's the symbiotic relationship that you're talking about between the active and the contemplative. We've gone so far down in the West, the path of Cain and Martha, but we obviously need the Cains and the Martha, but we need them matured by the Abels and the Marys. And so what has happened in our culture, and this also infects the church as well as the broader culture, is that the Cains have taken over, they've colonized in an imperial manner the notion of the self, and then those who have artistic contemplative leanings, they're almost felt to be outsiders. They don't belong. They're not a part of on the ship, almost. And so the call to the contemplative, in fact, is a listening to the Abel and the Mary within, and a recognizing when Cain takes over, he can kill, or when Martha takes over, gratefully doesn't kill, it's just too busy. But we obviously need the Cains and the Abel, provided they are in this dance, round dance with the Abels and the Mary. It's just any culture has tendencies to swing in what we call the pendulum theory in politics, or it can be the pendulum theory in culture. But we've swung so far to one element, or the teeter-totter has gone so far. There needs to be a call back, but that doesn't mean an undermining of the vita activa in any way. I mean, to be human is, the highest of the theological virtues is charity, faith, hope, and charity. And so love, part of love is in fact being active, but discerningly knowing how to be active from a still, T.S. Eliot talks about a still point in the moving world. So our love is not a misdirected or an erratic love. This is explored deeply. Someone like in C.S. Lewis's brilliant work, Till We Have Faces, between the two characters.
The sisters.
The two sisters, yes. And so the one is very loving but not discerning. The other seems to be caring, but like Scylla, she devours her sister to fill her emptiness. Oriole becomes the queen eventually. And so Lewis explored this very intricate, subtle, sophisticated way, what Eliot's grappling with in Four Quartets. But no, your point is absolutely right. It's not either or. It's learning. It's learning the identity dance.
Yeah, and it seems though. I want to come back to this word I used about hierarchy, because it's not sort of like they need to exist in this equilibrium of 50-50, but rather do they fit together in a certain relationship of authority. And so like does the contemplative need to lead in a certain sense, and then in that way the active can come into its own in its proper place, and then can sort of move, can maybe the busy passions or that spirit then can lead towards its proper end. And I'm thinking of the Mary Martha. And so when Jesus is teaching and Mary is praised because she has chosen the better part, and you think, oh, poor Martha, she's just running off her feet. And but then later in that in that family, in that community that's following Jesus, Martha, when Lazarus dies, Martha is the one who has a confession of I know that you, I forget what she says, but that I believe even now that you can, if you say the word and Lazarus will be raised. I feel bad for quoting scripture wrong, but as I wonder if there's sort of an archetypal story there of maybe Martha's busyness, and she runs out to Christ, right? But then she has that confession of belief in the resurrection and in his power. So, but I wonder if you could sort of reflect on, does there need to be kind of a guiding priority of the Abel or the Mary or the contemplative life, and how does it kind of function to give a home and a health to the via activa?
Well, absolutely, and both should be. In the classical tradition, all should be guided. Heed the good, the true, and the beautiful. This has always been the great welcoming reality of classical. So if the contemplative is not heeding the whispers, the wooing, the calling of the good, true, and beautiful, which deal with the ethical, the aesthetic, the abstract, and then of course the mystical, which the contemplative is very much a meditative mystical, which is a part. The contemplative can go askew as well, and so needs a healthy active to complement it. And so within everybody's soul, they need to be acutely aware that the contemplative about the active become lean and thin and retreat from the big challenges of life. The active without the contemplative can very much be a person who seems to be doing important things, and this could even be injustice issues. They can seem to be doing important things, but the deeper motivations are problematic, which doesn't mean a person shouldn't be concerned about justice and peace and ecological issues. They absolutely should be. But if the deeper motivations which inspire this are not grounded in more solid places, those very longings for the good can use the good and distort it. There's a lovely quote in Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. Beckett talks about that how near the end of his life, when he was going to be executed, that he talks about how those who seem to be serving the good are using the good to serve them. And it becomes more subtle in religion or politics or the important things in life, which are about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so if the deeper motives are not examined, which is what the burning of the false self is supposed to be about, the contemplative or the activist can use good things and distort them to serve questionable ends. And so this is why both need to be purified by the fire of love in that deeper sense. And if that doesn't take place, then the contemplative can become narcissistic as much as the active can become narcissistic or egoistic in that sense. And so these deeper questions of what is human nature, what is identity, which are often not explored in much depth amongst many spheres or disciplines of life, the contemplative, certainly the Christian tradition has gone to those places, and one does not have to read very far, and many of the desert mothers or fathers, or Gregory of Nyssa, or Augustine's work, or John Chrysostom, or many of the great medieval mystics and contemplativism, some modern ones, to see the depths they're going to and what they're realizing has to be let go of to be transformed to phoenix-like resurrect into the new being, which is always there, just waiting to be birthed, waiting to be midwifed. But the busyness, the noise, the clatter, the chatter that often goes on, it's like we have in our backyard a forest, and where there's a lot of noise during the day, we have lots of deer up there. There's a lot of noise up there. The deer just don't come out. But when dawn or dusk comes, it's very quiet. Twilight or light is just coming or leaving, very still. Then the deer begin to come out of the forest and down closer to our home. And it's like our lives. We think if in our busyness, we think the I is the busy self, we're not quiet enough to realize that the deer within is waiting to come out of the forest. And it's not that the deer isn't there, but we're too busy, and we scare the deer back into the forest. And so it's the shy deer, which is the deeper part in all of us, or the image and likeness of God, in that sense, that is always waiting, but it's in the forest. And it will not come out until there's enough quietness and stillness to emerge, to appear. But if we're constantly busy and active, then the danger is to think there is no deer. In fact, it's not there is no deer. We're just too busy to allow the deer to emerge from within us, or to use the classical sense, to be birthed, to be midwife.
Mm-hmm. And that inner self, I'm being reminded of, I was at a conference on patristics, and I met an Orthodox priest from Romania, I think, or Georgia. He's from an Eastern European country. I remember him saying that he was concerned about the sort of modern vision of searching for the authentic self, and that in this pursuit we imagined it was kind of an autonomous me, or an autonomous I, so that if we would kind of travel inside and hear the authentic voice of the self, it would be this kind of, I don't know, this kind of human atheological self. But that's not the vision of, that's not the kind of Christian understanding of this deer that you were talking about, that could emerge in the in the silence of contemplation. So do you want to say something about how we can understand what we would be meeting if we were to be able to be still, that it wouldn't be kind of the kind of Hegelian authentic voice of me, but that there's a really important theological piece there, or even Christological piece there.
There's often distinctions made between which your friend from Romania may talked about the autonomous self, the individualism, and personhood. And this distinction, which has been reflected on for decades, really in a more pronounced way, is that, first of all, individualism, or the atomistic self, or the autonomous self, is frequently isolated from others in the search for meaning, for purpose. Certainly in the history of Western political thought, there are various conditions that have to exist for the authentic just coming again from a Greek word authentikos, or genuine leather, the genuine self, just like existentialism is existential, you're stepping out of what you are not and stepping into who you might be. Now that can be distorted and demeaned by certain versions of existentialism, but the deeper meaning is stepping away from who you think you are into who you're meant to be. And so some of the conditions that exist for that is philosophy as friends. So who are the people on the journey you can trust? The philia notion of love, who will be honest when we're dishonest, when we're sabotaging ourselves, when we're undermining ourselves. They'll speak truth to us in that deeper sense. So friendships are very important. What is the community we're a part of? This is why the historic church, the parish, para oikos, in that sense, the family, the oikos, the para oikos, was the bigger faith family. So who is the bigger family we are attached to that can be honest with us, in which our ability to love will be tested? We'll be inevitably encountering people we see things different from. They approach things in sometimes opposite ways than us. But what does it mean to be charitable, to be tried on the anvil of a larger faith family that we may collide with at times, and other times we'll have a great deal of affinity with, we'll be knit together with on the journey? What's the soil that we're planted in, from which the tree of our new being will emerge, and hopefully, if it's a healthy tree, will produce fruit abundant on the journey? What's the nature of our integrity as we go inward? Are we willing to go to those painful, those difficult, those frustrating, those places of hurt, of suffering and tragedy, and see that deeper than that is life, and life abundant? Which doesn't mean that tragedies go away. That doesn't mean shamanic-like, that all things will work out well. But how do we deal with the disappointments, the betrayals in life, and overcome them in charity and goodness? And this is, of course, the whole center of what Christ is about in the cross, being betrayed, and yet, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And how can we say that to people who have betrayed us, who have hurt us? It either calls forth bitterness, anger, disappointment, or it calls forth a deeper level of love and the doing of that. And so we go through life again and again in which that deeper part can be called forth, but it depends on whether we're willing to allow it to be called forth, or whether we'll get frozen or embalmed in a certain understanding of the self and respond to relationships, to situations in a way that shrink us as people. And that little acorn never breaks through its shell to become the oak tree that it's meant to be.
Mm-hmm. What are the resources that you have found and that the tradition has preserved for leading people to kind of quietly and contemplatively encounter the truth.
I think the work you've done on the mystagogy, certainly baptism and the Eucharist, are foundational to signals sent our way in terms of the dying, the going under, the water of eternity washing over us, the resurrecting, the participation when it's just not a formal exercise, but when internalized properly. The Eucharist is about a little seed of a grape being crushed. It becomes the grape, but the grape is crushed again. So there's multiple deaths and resurrections. The same with the wheat. The little skin of the wheat has to die to become the field of wheat, and then that field has to be crushed to become the bread of eternity. And so the two dominant sacraments, and there are others, when understood not just as a cognitive experience, but in fact when heart and head, the Greek word noetic here is very important. There's a tendency in the West to slip into, is it head or is it heart? It's the rationalist romantic issue. The Greek word nous, we get a word metanoia from that as well. Metanoia isn't just a change of mind, it's a change of being. A very being ontology comes out of that. Mm-hmm. Our being. So the sacraments, when properly understood in the context of the parish or the church, because they're worked out in the context of community, we're not isolated little atoms. In fact, we are meant to be knit together as one. This is what John 14:17 is about, in terms of just as Father, Son, and Spirit are one. So we are meant to be as one as they are. And so the sacraments are foundational to a proper understanding of formation, transformation, deification, rather than just formal exercises. And for many people, sadly, they're just formal experiences that never get deeply understood, internalized, or what it means to participate in the actual meaning of them with Christ's presence and participating in the Spirit in Christ. And so I would also say, obviously, regular attendance and participation in this, in community, are foundational, along with friendships, along with community. Obviously, our life in Christ is foundational to what that means, and that takes place within the context of the Corpus Christi, the body, the actual body of Christ, which embodies Christ on earth to the best that it's meant to be. And obviously there's aberrations and distortions and caricatures of that. But the sacraments, when they're properly understood, raise that vision up to the highest level and then ground it in the earth.
Yeah.
In a more meaningless way. Christians who are not acutely aware of the ecological crisis we're in, or not engaged in ecological issues, don't understand even the meaning of the incarnation. It's coming to earth. Earth is sacred. And so elements, I remember when my wife and I were married, there, the Anglican Church had this policy, which I often found somewhat ironic, that they would not marry you outside. It could only be in the church. And you want to say, why the cathedral of nature? And we chose to be married in the cathedral of nature, mm-hmm. With a special wine and cup that was carved by friends on the part of a great tree. So it was just sitting on the bottom of this tree. So it was a wonderful. People had to drive 20 kilometers down a dirt road and then walk a kilometer to get to it. But it's the notion that somehow the physical world should not be included in an actual marriage ceremony, which is meant to embody the bridegroom, mystically and analogically, and it's done in the earth and on the soil and the trees and the forests and the mountains. Avalanche lilies coming out, the snow still just retreating up the mountainside. And so I think one of the important things certainly is a certain wing of Christianity, and it doesn't have to be done in a liberal, trendy way. There's a groundedness in ecological understanding, which is deeply, can come out of a deeply contemplative place. And I think sacraments, the two sacraments are deeply physical things.
Yeah. And they engage with and kind of proclaim a holistic anthropology, right? And a very pre-modern anthropology. So the sacraments don't envision humanity as kind of floating brains or floating kind of consciousnesses. They engage with our bodies and our minds. And as you say, kind of affirming and adoring and proclaiming the incarnation of Christ as well.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like to recapture the contemplative life, which is coming back to our first question, quid est veritas, what is truth, is some of the kind of tried and true paths towards truth include it is the contemplative life, but it's an embodied life, and that the sacraments are indispensable to that journey towards truth.
I would say, which we haven't touched on a lot, is the importance of learning. I mean, there is a whole tradition, a sort of a form of pietism and quietism that sees learning in the thinking life as problematic and that leads you astray. And in fact, it is the best of learning that deepens us in wisdom and insight. And this is why the classical tradition of paideia in the Greek sense, or humanitas in the Latin sense, or humanities, is an a formed life has also a lot to do with being informed by the best that the Church has thought, said, and done, of which the sacraments, of which the contemplative active. We might also, the whole element of justice is very, very important, and sadly so in our culture wars. We get the progressive use the language of justice, and the conservative use the language of justice, and both have rather thin notions of justice. One of our great Canadian Anglicans and political philosophers was George Grant. He did a fine, fine work called English-Speaking Justice, in which he takes people back to the much deeper meaning of justice and how it was understood in the classical sense, and how it's been demeaned and distorted and thinned out in the culture wars of conservative, progressive, or liberal. And so these are also, so there's an organic vision of the kingdom of God, which we pray 3 times a day in the Paternoster, that needs to be grappled with, and recovering memory then is a bit getting back to those older truths. In fact, if we forget or lose them, then we just become playthings of whatever's trendy in culture.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think could you say more about how Grant thinks, how does he characterize the kind of older and richer vision of justice?
Yeah, so it's a big question. I mean, Plato's Republic, he's very immersed in that particular one. The Laws, the Statesman, Gorgias, these key works. So, I mean, one element in, say, the progressive wing, the language of equality and choice and liberty. Well, what informs equality, choice, liberty? Now, to question equality in our time is to question the doctrine of the creeds of liberalism. Mm-hmm. You raise the question of hierarchy, you're seen as a problem. And there's legitimate reasons to critique hierarchy, its aberration. But if we read, say, Dionysius, they are opposite, or people like this, there's a legitimate place. There is good, better, best. There is bad, worst, worse. And so Grant is very interested in what's the relationship, when we think justice, in the tension between equality and hierarchy. And so our culture tends to prioritize. This is largely a post-Reformation notion that gets accelerated in elements of the French Revolution, Enlightenment, Russian Revolution, liberalism, to see equity, equality as everything without saying, well, what's the downside of that? Someone like a Friedrich Nietzsche comes along and he exposes that, says the emperor has no clothes on. He's very much into hierarchy. A lot of Nietzsche, and realizing that the genuine life is overcoming the weaknesses within the pandering to sentimentality and thinness. Now, his understanding of hierarchy would obviously be different than the Christian understanding, but he does say that equality without hierarchy leads to a trivializing of human possibility. And on the other hand, so thoughtful people today, Grant would argue that justice means questioning. I mean, he's not against equality of opportunity, but what people do with their opportunities bases on personal discipline, personal temperament, personal gifts, all these variables. But what's the important role of hierarchy in determining what meaningful justice is as well? Now, hierarchy can be abused, so can equality. So what's the relationship of justice in looking at the dance between equality and hierarchy? And often what happens in the culture wars, the right will turn to hierarchy and the left will do equality, and they absolutize them. And you want to say, listen, both have truths in them, but both have untruths in them. And the dance between them is absolutely essential for an understanding of justice in that classical sense. Like Plato, for example, wasn't against women becoming part of the guardian class. It wasn't a question for him of gender, it was a question of nature. So if a person was gifted to be a good teacher, man or woman, or a person was a good athlete, man or woman, whatever, then it was their nature that prepared them for leadership, not their gender. Aristotle and Plato differed on this one. And Plato in that sense goes deeper than just the male-female issue. He also says there are gifts, and you can have women who are far better teachers than men. So why should man be the teacher, or organization gifts? What's the nature? What's the gifts they've been given? And but again, and then the hierarchy of the roles you take based on the gifts that have been given, in terms of more substantive issues, and lesser issues, and more responsible issues, less responsible issues, the implications of, say, the guardian class, the decisions they have to make for the good of the polis, stuff like that. But for justice, so Grant in English-speaking justice goes after John Rawls' notion of justice, which was just an apologia for a trendy form of liberalism and equity, and equality and choice and liberty, these sort of questions. Grant comes and says, well, there's truth in that, but there's untruth. And so a discerning mind, or diakrisis in that sense, cuts through the fat from the good. It's, in that sense, it separates the dross from the gold, the wheat from the chaff. That's much harder to do than genuflecting to one tribe or the other in the culture wars. And often someone like Erasmus in his time was trying to make sense of that. The danger of that, if you're not this or you're that, then you get shot at from both sides. And it's like if Jesus was confronted, are you a Pharisee? No. Are you a Sadducee? No. Are you Herodian? No. Are you a Zealot? No. Are you an Essene? No. Are you a Samaritan? No. But there's a tendency in the culture wars to say you have to be that or this. And these are your only two options, where a thoughtful person says, there's far more options than that in the search for truth and goodness and beauty in that sense. And that's a part of there's a lovely saying, le lotta continue, the struggle, the journey goes ever on, the battle goes ever on. And that's a part of the ongoing faith journey of trying to discern from the depths the soul, the community, public responsibility, and what that looks like. Often when people want kindergarten answers, Sunday school answers to complex personal, communal, larger justice, ecological, social questions, much more difficult to recognize. This is a layered complex issue, and be wary of tribalism, either in the church or the world. This is why I think, for example, in our culture of polarization, you get the liberal progressives will turn on someone like a Jordan Peterson, who says the emperor has no clothes on, whereas many conservatives just genuflect to him, and you want to say, why does it have to be this, or why does it have to be that? What's the insights of Peterson provide? What's his blind spots? But he's also obviously popular because he's speaking certain truths that the liberal Sanhedrin or liberal orthodoxy does not want to hear. And so in that sense, the culture wars are just secularized version of religious wars in which there is an orthodoxy. And if you don't agree, then you're a heretic or you're heterodox. And so it's just a modern version of new religion, in that people cling to what they see as certain ultimate issues, their ideological agenda, and if a person doesn't fit in with it, then they're heretics. And so it's just the secularizing of religious distinctions. They get quite nasty, but then they got nasty in religious wars too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I want to kind of close on a more personal sense. And who have been your companions? Maybe personal, but maybe more kind of figures from the tradition who've been your companions on your journey of discerning the truth, or pursuing the truth, or in search of the image of God.
Yeah, so I would say in my journey, I would say the great classical tradition of Plato and Aristotle have been very important to me. Homer, the tragedians, particularly Aeschylus, there's how do we live into tragedy and suffering? The comedic tradition, which says there are suffering, there is struggle, but eventually things will work out good within time. That's not the reality for many. My years on staff with Amnesty International, I met some of the most heroic, the bravest women and men in my life, and their stances they took made many of us look like cowards in terms of bigger public issues. Their lives did not end well. Many of them were killed. They died slow deaths, and those who did survive, being tortured, imprisoned, psychological remains of their lives stayed with them, nightmares to the rest of their life. So I found in my own life, how do I live the comedic tragic? And the Greeks thought through that element. One of the dilemmas of Christianity is that it gives us the resurrection, the eucatastrophe. And so there's a tendency for many Christians to think if you're in Christ or you're Christian, things will work out. Yes, you go through your difficult, what the Greeks called the agon, the struggle, the agony in that sense, but it will turn out good in the end. Well, that's just not true for many people. And so I've found although the prophetic tradition is very good on that as well, because many of the prophets were not treated the best, and some of them didn't end their journey as well. So I've always found in the Jewish tradition, in the Greco-Roman tradition at its best, a richness and a mother lode that's informed me and shaped my understanding of myself, what it means to teach, what it means to be there with people. And then how the mothers and fathers, the ammas and the abbas of the Western Christian tradition, the Eastern tradition, internalized the wisdom of the common grace, the general revelation that the Greco-Roman tradition knew and experienced and understood, and the best of the Jewish tradition, it was given to the Jews. And then, of course, the coming to be of Christ, you get a congealing of what that means in John 14:17, the Beatitudes. Some of the women of the East, Macrina, who elder and younger, who taught, some of the finest of the Eastern fathers, the wisdom of this is Sophia. I've always found Ambrose and Augustine, although Augustine could go a little off at times, but Ambrose, there's a richness to Ambrose.
Mm-hmm. Are there particular works in Ambrose that were meaningful for you?
I've always found his exegesis, which had a huge impact on the young Augustine in Milan, was very valuable, because Augustine, someone like today who had 5 PhDs or something, but he goes to Milan restless. He's in his early 30s at this point. He's experimented with all sorts of things which have left him empty. And Ambrose shows him how to read the Bible allegorically and typologically from the lectern in the cathedral in Milan. So his exegesis is very layered. Is rich. His politics, in which he had to go to the emperor when the emperor went to Thessalonica and wiped out most of the city, and Ambrose said to the emperor, "You're not coming into the cathedral until there's penance and there's restorative justice done to the citizens of Thessalonica," the brutal treatment. Prophet like Ambrose. Erasmus would be one of the great important mentors to me. His irenical, his peacemaking, probably the way he summed up the rich Western tradition. His final great works on Origen, so Origen and Clement for Erasmus. And there's some wonderful works now being done on recovering the best of Origen against the distortions. But Erasmus in the 16th century was one of the few which was reviving the East and the West. Mm-hmm. And Origen, he did the first real critical biography of Origen. Erasmus did. So his irenical way that wouldn't get caught into some of the denominational culture wars, the theological cultures wars, the exegetical culture wars. Erasmus has been very valuable. He's often forgot in the English Reformation when people focus on people like Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer, Hooker, Jewell, Caroline Devines, is that Erasmus played a very significant role in the English Reformation. He's just not a continental reformer. He spent many times in England, taught at Cambridge for many years, and he's forgotten. And there's a fine book called Exploiting Erasmus, which just tracks the role of the forgotten Erasmus in the English of the long Reformation Church of England. And so, I would say Erasmus is his irenical, his peace-loving approach, his refusal to be taken in by any of the religious ideologies of the time. So Thomas Merton has meant, I'm teaching a course this semester on Thomas Merton. And again, people, I think, problematically will co-opt Merton to serve various interests, like they can co-opt Jesus or anybody, depending on how anybody interprets something. But Merton's been very important on my faith journey. So there's this cloud of witnesses. Or the communion of the saints that we say in the Creed. I believe in the communion of the saints, or what Hebrews talks about, the cloud of witnesses that cheers us on. And there's been various men and women. Probably one of the most important would be my wife on the journey, Karen, spiritual director. She's been a spiritual director for probably 35 years. And so wonderful lady in terms of truth telling. Yeah. So I think those who are nearest and closest to us, like our spouses, siblings, and dear friends, the Philia, Sophia, I would say many of those have been very important in my own formation, my own growth and journey, of which goes ever on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I think we'll maybe draw it to a close there. So you've given us some great names to start with, some works to look at. You've reminded us of the importance of the sacraments in our journey towards truth, the importance of the church, and not just the church as an idea, but the church as in the parochial church, the parish, the local parish, the smaller communion of saints, the contemporary communion of saints that we belong to, and the communion of saints that stretches back through centuries and millennia. of sojourners that we belong to.
I'd also say one thing we do know at the level of practical experience. Right? This comes back to memory and memoricide and overcoming freedom. If any of us, when we go to bed at night, under the sheets, we wake up in the morning and we have no memory, how do we orient? And this is what's happened to a culture, a civilization, and then we wonder why people are disoriented or fragmented or all over the place. They've lost the maps, the landmarks have been destroyed, and then we wonder why we're in the cultural chaos we are. But we do know at a very personal level, if we were to go to bed at night and wake up, we don't know how to orient because we orient through memory.
Mm.
And when we take memory away, then it's virtually impossible to orient. So we just stumble from one thing to another because memory is a map. But when a civilization, a cultural, religious memory is taken away, that significantly explains the problems we have today. Because when maps are gone, when landmarks are taken away, when cairns disappear, in Canada when Inuksuks are gone, orientation becomes a real problem. Noam Chomsky once says memory is a form of intellectual self-defense. And many people who study at public universities, because they have no memory, they just accept what they're told. But a person who's grounded and rooted in a memory can speak back to a teacher and say, well, that's just not true. Or you're just distorting a history, or you're distorting a culture. And so I would say the prime work of education at universities, seminaries, and in the churches should be one of restoring memory, because that is a form of intellectual self-defense against the trendiness that dominates all spheres of our culture today.
And in that sense, looking back would be what is truly progressive,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And recovering the cairns, the wayfinders, recovering the map of our tradition would be kind of one of the most responsible moves we can make when we wake up in the morning, and not just the individual, but the kind of the ship of the church. Each morning is where we're facing the context and the calling of each day to hold tightly to our orienting, the orienting voices of our fathers and mothers in the tradition, is part of our calling, and to not throw them away, and to not wake up each morning as an amnesiac.
And this is not so often. What happens is when people talk this way, then they're accused of being nostalgic or sentimental for some golden age, and that totally misses the point entirely, because there's great truths of the human soul and society embodied in the thinking and lives of those women and men of the past that we've forgotten, and hence it explains our cultural chaos. And so this is not an attempt to be nostalgic of some golden age. It's an attempt to find the mother lode in a mine of truth of which we've simply covered over. When we first moved into this place, it's quite a trek up to the top of the hill here, and we'd been here a few weeks, and got into some of the trees, and I moved my feet around a bit, and I discovered there was a trail that actually took us all the way through this wooded forest up to the top of the mountain. And so discovering that trail, it allowed me to navigate very quickly through trees and rocks all the way up to the top. And so that wasn't nostalgic for some bygone age. It was recognizing the trails of the past open up the possibilities of moving nimbly through the challenges and terrain that we live in today. When those paths are overgrowing, then it's understandable why people don't know how to orient. And so there's an arrogance in the progressive notion of history that then leaves people disoriented by taking away from them the trails, the paths, the lead to life that allow them to navigate the difficult passages at times. So it has nothing to do with nostalgia or sentimentality or golden ageism. It's that we have lost truths that make us human.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, we have dehumanized ourselves.
And so the modest attempt in this podcast and in our discussion today for anamnesis, for remembering, is my aim is simply to move away some of that overgrowth, and to reveal those paths, and to highlight them, and to refamiliarize the church, contemporary culture, with those riches of those paths, to that healthful remembering. So thank you for this conversation, for one small hike together, in search of that remembering, and in search of that kind of clarity that orients us to the truth, to the way, the truth, and the life.
Well, I'm sure you'll be interviewing many wise people as you go along, which will open up the Catholicity or Cataholis, the fullness of the epic vision of faith that will gradually put the story back together again.